Hello, this is Stephen Andrews, outlaw bookseller in a prohibited place, looking out for low-flying aircraft. This is J.G. Ballard, Deep Ends, 2022 review. So as you see, I didn't get arrested in the prohibited area. There were actually some people there flying small model planes on the airfield. Maybe they're forces guys, but obviously they had permission. There's quite a few of them. It's like a little sort of jamboree going on there. So I thought it was time for some Ballard, as you can tell by now. And I thought we'd have a look at the new edition of Deep Ends for 2022, courtesy of Rick McGrath, editor and publisher at Terminal Press. And here we are, very beautiful as ever. This is a nice laminated boards edition, and he ran this off for me. And even though I didn't make a contribution to this one, I was planning to. I need to get the program ready because next year is the last Deep Ends. He put this little dedication in this one for me, which is really, really nice because I've been a bit of a proselitizer for Deep Ends. I have supported it, and I do enjoy sort of interacting with the guys who contribute to it on a regular basis. Some fantastic people. We'll talk about that. And I thought we'd look at the outstanding part of my Ballard collection. We've looked at the demis and the royals. I thought we'd have a look at the octavos and crown quarters and what have you, the smaller books. So you can see what else I have there. I don't have a lot in Ballard in paperback. I used to have loads, but I sort of cut back as I bought the hardcovers, and some of them I should have hung on to. And I was quite lucky when I met him to have about 16 books signed, which is great. So fantastic stuff. What a man he was. So without further ado, let's have a look at Deep Ends 2022. So here it is. Lovely, as I say, laminated boards. And the beauty of Deep Ends is that it's like a magazine. You can just pick it up and read it. We're never in a Ballardian mode. There's the contents page there. And we have some marvellous stuff. There's lots of short stories by different people and who have interesting backgrounds. Lawrence Russell, Bernard Secord, Rick McGrath, the editor himself, good story there. Maxim Jakubowski, fantastic writer. Hey Max, hope all is cool. And Paul H. Williams has done some fantastic concept art for Vermilion Sands. Story by Paul A. Green called Remote Sensing, which is good. One of the highlights every year for me in Deep Ends is David Pringle's Ballard Chronology. David's done an episode of this for each edition of, or each issue, as I like to say, of Deep Ends. And in this one, he covers 83 to 91, which is where Ballard becomes a bestseller and breaks into the mainstream. And it's sort of great stuff. And it's fantastic. And what he does, he goes chronologically and highlights all the different sort of events in Ballard's publishing and personal life, but also lots of contextual stuff of what's happening in the world around it. And it really makes you think, because, I was young then and in my heyday and first selling SF, and I first read Ballard in the early 80s. And there's all sorts of stuff going on, there's not just the stuff in Britain with the Falklands War, the miners' strike, Thatcherism. There's all sorts of other things. It makes you realise that, that was the beginning maybe of terrorism becoming, obviously it was around in the 70s and around before that, but you forget some of the stuff that's going on, and it comes across as a far more chaotic, turbulent and sort of Ballardian decade than I remembered. And it does sort of bring those things back, Challenger, the space shuttle disaster and all sorts of stuff. So it's fascinating reading, and David just knows his stuff. And I'm hoping at some point, and I don't know if I've mentioned this to Rick, that if Rick sort of collects together all the chronologies that David has done, there's an actual book in there, full J.G. Ballard chronology, and I'm really hoping that happens because it would be fantastic. Just to show you some of the artwork, there's the frontispiece for Paul Green's story, Remote Sensing. Isn't that great? And you get this lovely double column and all these lovely bits of artwork. And I know Rick said to me he wanted me to read the whole thing before I commented, but I do read it like a magazine. There's the frontispiece of Max's story, which I love. It's fantastic. I love Max's writing, and he knew Ballard quite well, and he has really nailed the Ballardian short story, I feel, more than anybody else who's contributed. And we've had some great contributors over the years. Paul DeFilippo, myself, I'm a great contributor. My friend James Reich out in the States. Hey James, hope you're well. He's got a new novel coming. This story, Latent Content, by Rick, was very good and references another Ballard story. I'm not going to tell you which one, in the same way that My Story Saucer Occupant from a few years back in Deep Ends referenced the Venus Hunters. This references one as well. You can find it for yourself. And it's great, you know, and there's some great stories in there. And as you see, all lovely artwork throughout. So it's great stuff. This is a smaller issue than normal. I say next year's is supposedly the last print one, so perhaps it'll be called The Last Deep Ends, in a quasi-Ellisonian thing, as The Last Dangerous Visions as we know never happened. And yeah, just have a look at some of Paul H. Williams' concept art for Vermilion Sands a moment on page 76. I'll just find it. I've got the shades on because it's really hot and I'm in front of a window and it's glaring. And let's just have a look. So here we go. And there's the one on the back again. Fantastic stuff. And Paul H. Williams imagined these with Mid-Journey, which I think is a kind of computer program. I think Jim Burns has been doing stuff with it recently. I know Jim's been doing stuff online, and I hope to interview Jim at some point because we are in touch via the medium of the internet. He doesn't live very far from me. He lives in Trowbridge, where I occasionally work. So yes, he's got these great pictures of the houses at Vermilion Sands and characters and moments and what have you. So they're really lovely. They're not the way I imagine them, but that's the beauty of this. It shows you the sort of way that Ballard influenced all sorts of writers and thinkers and all sorts of schools and disciplines, and everybody's got their own take on it, but there is a sort of commonality because he really was a visionary and he tapped into the psychopathology of the late 20th and early 21st century in a big way. So that's Deep End. You can get that on Amazon. You won't see it in bookshops. It's print on demand. There's a paperback, a hardcover, but very beautiful, as you can see. So if you're a Ballardian or you're thinking of delving into, you know, Ballardian fandom and what is produced collectively in terms of creativity, Deep Ends is the thing. So there you go. What have I got here? Tiger Who Came to Tea bookmark, Judith Kerr, who is of course married to Nigel Neal, and I'm waiting for a Nigel Neal book to arrive so I can review it. So hopefully by the time this comes out, I'll have done the Nigel Neal review, you've seen it, and I'll be sort of, you know, I'll be sort of unstuck in time in the Billy Pilgrim fashion. But I quite like that, you know, I like to mix things up. So just let's take a look at some Ballard hardcover firsts. This is Arkham House. Arkham House, of course, was founded by August Derleth to preserve the legacy of H.P. Lovecraft, and it's still going, and they still do the Lovecrafts. They've done lots of other great stuff over the years. In the 80s and 90s, mostly in the 80s, they did a lot of really good SF. People like Michael Bishop, Michael Swanwick, Lucius Shepard, really lovely books, and a lot of them are still in print. They tend to reprint stuff very often, and this was the Ballard they did, and this is all sort of Ballard's rather Malmsbergian stories. They're Ballardian stories, but they do remind me of the famous trilogy by Barry Malmsberg of, you know, spaced out astronauts, the space oddity Major Tom figures of new wave SF. And so there's all those stories are collected together in this, and it's got a lovely Max Ernst cover there from the painting Europe After the Rain. And of course Europe After the Rain, you know, I think Ballard was a fan of Ernst. He was a fan of all the surrealists. I'm a huge fan of them as well. And John Fox, the electronic artist who's done an album with a Ballardian theme or two in his time, also recorded a single years back in the early 80s called Europe After the Rain. So you see these things all mesh, you know, culture spreads out, and books, music, films, visual art, all these things, they're all the same thing. They're all sort of expression. They're all connected. So, you know, don't limit yourself just to reading SF books. Take it wider. So I think you can maybe, I think that's out of print, that one, but it is a beautiful book, so as you can see. Right, anyway, going back to, as I say, David Pringle covering the sort of 80s, really, when Empire of the Sun came out and Ballard, you know, finally made some proper money, and the film of Empire of the Sun was made by Steven Spielberg. There were lots of reissues, and Cape, who had been Ballard's publisher for a long time, I mean, The Drowned World was a Gollancz book, and he moved to Cape. When did he move to Cape? I think it was late 60s, early 70s, and late 60s it would have been. And basically Cape reissued some of the books, and I got them all at the time, and this is the reissue of The Drought, which is probably my favourite of the initial tetralogy of disaster novels. For me, the writing in this is the best. It's got a wonderful infodump section in it, and, you know, very prescient, and it's great. I got him to sign all of these. I'm not going to show you the signatures of the seal ones. You'll see them in the other videos, which I've done. And yeah, I really like that one. I think The Drought's an underrated book, and these are lovely. And I bought the whole set, as you will see, and Then, of course, there's this wonderful short story, The Disaster Area, which I know Graham Greene was very keen on. And these are lovely. And, you know, this is the thing. You don't get reissue programs like this anymore for hardcovers. And that's partially, I guess, because of e-readers and the way the whole industry's gone. It's a real shame because it's nice to see reissues now and again, because sometimes they were prettier than the first edition hardcovers. And very often, of course, they're a lot cheaper to buy them new in a reissue than to buy a collectible first. So there you go. Finishing off the sort of disaster, catastrophe, tetralogy in the 60s was The Crystal World, which is where the very sort of thick vein of surrealism came into Ballard's work. And this is a fantastic book. I mean, I don't want to say too much about them because the plots are really not that important. It's more about the psychology and the actual writing. And in this, the jungles in Africa start to crystallize and what have you. And it's about this vision of time sort of ceasing. And there's this wonderful parodic new wave bit of writing in this where he infodumps into why it's happening, and it's to do with some sort of cosmic event. And you can almost feel the tongue in his cheek, poking through a hole, into your reality, saying that, this is just a bit of a joke. I don't need to infodump. It's a convention, so I'm going to sort of take the mick of it. In The Drought, he does it, very, very convincingly in about a paragraph. Wonderful sort of explanation of why the drought is happening, because of polymers forming chains on top of the ocean and preventing evaporation and rain coming. And it's completely convincing. It's really good. It's one of the very best sort of novums, as it were, in a catastrophe novel for why the catastrophe is happening. And of course, before that, 2 books before that, in The Wind from Nowhere, he didn't bother at all. The wind comes from nowhere and you never know why. It's never explained, which was even more audacious. And then in sort of Crystal World, he's got this ironic kind of joke one. One of the later books, The Day of Creation, reminds me of this in a way, in that, it's a tropical setting again. It's a bit of river which just sort of bursts out of nowhere and what have you. But great. In the tetralogy, you've got the opening with no sort of explanation. Then you've got Drowned World and The Drought with explanations. And then you get this sort of ironic one in this, which is absolutely fantastic. It really is. To complete that tranche of reissues, Cape then went with the final volume. Was it the middle volume? I can never remember. Of the urban trilogy of Crash, High Rise, Concrete Island. And I think this is regarded as a more minor book, but I actually think Concrete Island's really good, and I'd love to see a film version of this. I think it would work brilliantly. So those are the 4 things that Cape reissued at that point to cash in on the Ballard success of Empire of the Sun, because they'd lost Ballard, because at that point there was a certain sort of feeling that his last few books at Cape weren't selling very well, and the bids came in from Gollancz, and he flipped back to them because he hadn't been with Gollancz since The Drowned World and the very early books back in the early 60s. These are all sealed, and I'm not going to open them out because it's such a faff, to be honest, so do apologise, but we'll sort of go through them. And I think 1 or 2 of these I bought new. Some I bought at a glorious day in Hay when Cape had offloaded their file copies to a bookshop called The Bookshop on the Pavement. There's loads of Cape stuff there. And I've said many times, think of the channel, how much I love Jonathan Cape's books in the 70s and 80s. The designs are just so beautiful. And this is probably the jewel in the crown. This is my first edition of Crash. And I bought this probably 20 odd years ago, and I did buy this from a dealer, and it was quite pricey at the time, but it's rocketed in value. It's sort of like it's worth at least 10 times more than what I paid for it. And great cover that. It's got some sort of wear on it, and there's a bit of spine fading, but there you go. And there's the rear. Absolutely fantastic, and that for me is the most beautiful edition of Crash there's ever been. Fantastic stuff. Talking about the urban trilogy again, this is the first edition of High Rise. And High Rise is probably my least favourite of the 3. There's Jimmy there in the back looking rather cool. And I always felt, obviously it's one of the more extreme Ballards. It's got some most violence in it and some of the most off-the-chain stuff. And I've read it twice. And the first time, I can honestly say I didn't actually enjoy it very much. I didn't find it to be as controlled and stylistically sort of smooth and interesting as his other work, and I felt it was a bit sort of over the top. And to me, you know, there's a lot of people think Ballard is all about this, the extremes and stuff, and yeah, that's there, but it's more about the clinical, detached way, the classic new wave distancing, the modernist distancing, the descriptive passages of how he sort of approaches his characters and situations. And in High Rise, it was a lot more in your face. And of course, interestingly, High Rise came out in 75. Same year that David Cronenberg's first major commercial feature, Shivers, aka The Parasite Murders, aka They Came From Within, was released. And that also takes part in a high-rise block with people losing their inhibitions. These mutant parasites have been created and they've been dropped into various locations in the building to infect people, because their sort of creator believes that really mankind's become too civilized, and that's why we're all neurotic and we need to go back to the basic passions of sex and violence. And you know, so the two things sort of tie in. So it's obviously very zeitgeisty at the time. So Ballard and Cronenberg, who hadn't met then and probably hadn't heard of each other. I imagine Cronenberg probably heard of Ballard. The other way around, it probably wouldn't have happened. And it's pretty interesting. They both hit on the same thing pretty much the same time. So there we go. But moving on, late 70s and early 80s. I mean, a bit of an odd one for Ballard was this novel, Hello America, which was his last pure science fiction novel. And this came out, I think, round about 79, 80. And as you see, very beautiful. Jonathan Cape there again. Absolutely lovely. And the whole thing with this is that this imagines a near future America. This is from a 70s perspective, remember, with this being the oil crisis and what have you in the late 70s, and the prices were through the roof and the petrodollar thing. And America's been abandoned because it's become this dust bowl. And it's about an expedition many, many years later from Britain that goes over to explore America. And you see all the sort of iconography of the USA, the sort of Disney stuff, the rocket gantries, what have you, across this sort of empty continent. And I've only read it once. It's a long time ago, so I must reread it. But it seemed like a bit of a sore thumb at the time, because it sort of fell between the Urban trilogy and then the early 80s works, which were so much more fabular and more fantastical before he went into Empire of the Sun. It's almost as if he was psychologically preparing himself for that, rather like Kerens does at the end of The Drowned World. And I mean, this is a book which, I mean, I think this is really beautiful, and these now are really, really collectible, and they will cost you hundreds and hundreds of pounds, and I've got them in sort of beautiful condition because I bought them, as I say, they're mostly Cape file copies. And this was the one that one of the Cape reps have reportedly said, you know, this is not so much low flying aircraft as low selling, you know, books. So there you go, lovely pencil drawing there. And this has got some of the great sort of mid-period Ballard sort of stories in there. Absolutely lovely. And I love these jackets, and so gorgeous. And you know, I'm a real sucker for anything like this. So, and some great stories in there, including low flying aircraft, of course. Then another collection from that period, again, which has got some more sort of fabulous stuff. And at this point, to me, Ballard, he's more like Borges or Calvino or Primo Levi. You know, he's still writing science fiction, but it is more fabular and fantastical. And, you know, a lot of it is psychological, and it's beautiful stuff. And this is Myths of the Near Future, which has a particularly magical cover, I would say, a magical realist cover, perhaps, and really, really lovely. I need to reread all these books because it's been a long time, and you know, they're very beautiful, these editions. So they happened, I was in Hay and I'd been there for all day. It was a Sunday in the early 90s, and the bookshop on the pavement was the last bookshop I went, and I'd spent all my money. I didn't have a credit card then, which dates it before 93. There was no ATM in Hay then. You know, you had to take money with you, and that was it, you know, and not many people would take a cheque. And I borrowed some money off my friend Mark so I could buy some of the Ballards. The one I didn't get was the Atrocity exhibition with the Dali cover, which is like super rare. But I decided to go on quantity. And, you know, one of the final ones I got there that day was this one, The Unlimited Dream Company, which is probably his most fantastic novel. This is his fantasy novel, really. I think I cover this in 100 must-read fantasy novels. And I think it's set in Shepperton, or a small town like Shepperton, and there's a famous Jerry Bower picture of JG on the back, looking very urbane there. And it's about the people transforming in this sort of English sort of satellite town and learning to fly and sort of what have you, and it's just absolutely fantastic and beautiful stuff. And this is typical of what Cape did, really beautiful books. So that's a look at my smaller format Ballard first editions. It's very hard to talk about Ballard without falling into the usual cliches that people do about psychopathology and, you know, the media landscape. I just think that, you know, the thing to do with Ballard is just read him and let it soak it all up and be like a reptile, you know, be like Kerrans in the drum world and let it all seep into you and change your mind, and, you know, accept that the outrageous statements that he made, things like, I'd like more H-bombs at the bottom of my garden and I'm in love with Margaret Thatcher, all these things, to see them, you know, as a sort of expression of taking what people actually feel beneath the surface and raising it up and putting it out there in reality. And of course, you know, he was an outrageous figure, but a quietly outrageous one. And when people met him, you know, they expected this sort of foam dripping sort of psychopath, and you know, he was an ordinary family man. If you read his book Miracles of Life, which I do have a hardcover of, I've got a limited edition, I'll show you that in another video. Or I do my Ballard Curios, I've got some limiteds and paperbacks and bits and pieces, and we look at that again. But you know, he was absolutely charming in real life, and you know, very sort of urbane, sophisticated man. And he found a lot of the SF community rather excessive. He didn't do cons and stuff and what have you, and he sort of had reactions to some of the more sort of ultra characters, but you know, he was a real one-off, and it's a great shame he's gone. But you know, we've got the work, which is fantastic. So that's J.G. Ballard. Get yourself a copy of Deep Ends. They're all still in print, they're all fantastic. And hopefully I'll have something in next year's if I can find some time to write, because this YouTube thing is taking a lot of time away from me. I do have a big story which I've been planning for years and I haven't got around to. I've done a couple of drafts, so hopefully that will appear in the last Deep Ends in 2023. So get out there and buy it. Okay, so that's Deep Ends 2022, and we'll do the same again next year for 2023. Bye for now.